On Business Incorporated today, Africa's agenda as spring meetings begin in Washington, D.C. on Monday. And Spain to fund South Africa energy transition with 2.1 billion euros. And for the second time, United States dollar surpasses Zimbabwe dollar as currency in usage in Zimbabwe. Good afternoon. Welcome to Business Incorporated here on Channels Television. I'm Ini John Mekwa. Let's delve into business. And we start with the market. Equities traded, starting with Nigeria, we see the NGX gaining slightly at 0.01%. Could this be a relief we've been looking for this week? We'll see at the close of trade. Let's look at the numbers there. South Africa is also doing good, 0.72% at 77,208.88. And looking at other parts of Africa, we see in Egypt, it's negative, in fact, very negative, 1.59% at 16,748.52. While Kenya closed slightly negative yesterday at 0.01. We move right away to the Middle East to see what's happening there. And I tell you numbers, kind of confusing. Most of the markets in Middle East that's just had one number, and that's 0.31. We see Abu Dhabi at 0.31 in the red. We see Dubai, 0.31 in the red. We move over to Saudi Arabia, we see 0.31 in the red. What a coincidence. 3 markets having the same number, the same level of fall at the same time. Well, Qatar is different. It's in the red, but it's 0.16%. Now let's move to Europe now. We have Lars Halter joining us now. And Lars is telling us, first of all, the meeting between French Presidents Emmanuel Macron and EU Chief Ursula de Leyen are in Beijing to meet China's Xi Jinping. And it would be nice to know the details of this meeting. So Lars fills us in. Hi, Lars. Good afternoon.
Well, this visit is mostly about Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron wants to get China to talk to Russia and possibly help put an end to the war in Ukraine. China has said for a while that they are neutral in the conflict, but in fact, they are not neutral at all. Xi Jinping has had several phone calls with Vladimir Putin in the past year. Just weeks ago, there was even a personal meeting, and there was no contact with Ukraine, no call at all with Vladimir Zelensky. And that's a minimum of what Macron wants to achieve now. He would like for Xi to at least call Kiev. And he's brought along Ursula von der Leyen in what is also a symbolic move, supposed to show that this is not just France speaking, but in fact the EU. And the EU, of course, is an important partner to China, especially when it comes to trade. It's a complicated relationship, that's for sure, but one that is as important to China as it is to European countries. Macron has just said that trade between the EU and China is irreplaceable and that it has to be strengthened.
And then in EU also, we have the issue with the CHIPS Act. And EU is ready to give green lights to the CHIPS Act.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and Macron has also touched on that yesterday when he spoke to the French community in Beijing. He says that the EU has to, quote, de-risk our economies, never to be fully dependent on another country. And that is what's happening here. For too long, the EU and generally large parts of the world have been entirely dependent on China for the production of semiconductors. And now the EU wants to strengthen its own sector with the EU CHIPS Act. That is a 43 billion euro plan to boost the chip sector in the EU and catch up with the US and Asia. And it's a direct response, of course, to problems we've seen over the past few years. We just had a major supply chain crisis when China closed factories as well as ports during the pandemic. And over in Europe, that halted entire industries. Now, the Western alliance is striking back. Over the past few months, the US, Japan, and the Netherlands have restricted exports of some advanced chip-making machinery to China. So that's definitely hurting China.
Yeah, well, it seems it's a season of visit because we see another international visit has been making the news. Taiwan's leader just completed a tour of the United States. What do we know about Xi Jinping's reaction to all of this?
Yes, Taiwan's leader Tsai Ing-wen was in the US and in Central America, by the way. And just yesterday, she met with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in Los Angeles. And while this was billed as a private meeting, of course, it was clear to anger Beijing. For some background here, Taiwan has its own democratically elected government, but China sees the island as part of its territory. And so Beijing had a swift reaction, sending warships into waters around Taiwan to send a message. Now, while China as well as Taiwan are important trading partners to the US, this story, of course, is about much more than trade. This is about political power and the sovereignty of a country.
Mm. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Lars, for that, and we'll do this again tomorrow. Well, let's go to other markets now. Asia Pacific markets largely fell on Thursday as Wall Street digested the latest ADP private payrolls report, which showed slowing job growth in March. India's central bank held its benchmark interest rates, that's its policy repurchase rate, at 6.50%. That's defying expectations for the Reserve Bank of India to hike 25 basis points. The Indian rupee weakened 0.15% shortly after that announcement. Now, let's look at the numbers now. I will see the Nikkei 225 in the red at 1.22%. At 27,472.83. The Shanghai Composite almost undecided, even though it's looking a bit bullish. The Hang Seng Index is obviously green, 0.28% at 20,331.20. And then we have the Kospi in the red, 1.44%. Australia seems to have lost that excitement that came from its holding rates, is down 0.25%. That's for the Asia market. Moving over now to the United States, we see that stock features were mixed as investors consider what the latest data suggested about the health of the broader economy. Features tied to the Dow Jones. Let's look at the numbers again, and slightly up. That's for features, 0.02%. The S&P 500, however, lost it. It's in the red, 0.05%, as well as the NASDAQ. They're capturing most of those technology, ICT, and tech companies is down at 0.33%. That's for the United States. And we see that over the past several months, investors had shared signs of economic cooling on the hope that it could push the Federal Reserve to change course on its interest rate hiking campaign. And they are now wondering if the central bank has gone too far in its bid to cool inflation, tightening the economy to a point of economic slowdown or recession. The oil markets now, oil remained on track for weekly gains on Thursday with further production cuts targeted by OPEC Plus and a drop in the United States oil inventories shadowing fears over global economic growth. Brent crude futures was down 0.2%, that's about 15 cents to $84.84 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate crude dipped 17 cents, that's about 0.2% to $80.44. Brent and U.S. crude have both gained more than 6% this week alone following that cut, heading for a third weekly gain after OPEC Plus brought up that surprise production cost. Well, crude dipped on Thursday, however, as weak U.S. economic data raised concern over economic growth. The U.S. services sector also slowed more than expected in March, and U.S. job openings in February dropped to their lowest in nearly 2 years. In the metals market now, gold prices slipped from one-year highs we celebrated yesterday as the dollar regained some ground while investors awaited the U.S. non-farm payrolls report to gauge the Federal Reserve's monetary policy strategy. Spot gold was down 0.04% at 2019 per ounce after hitting its highest since March 2022 yesterday. That was Wednesday. U.S. gold futures also fell marginally to $2,035.30. The economic data points this week were major components supporting gold prices, while also noting that some profit booking ahead of the Good Friday holiday. Bullion has gained about 2.2% so far this week after surprise oil output cuts by OPEC Plus and weak U.S. economic data over the week added to fears of an economic slowdown and sent the yellow metal soaring above $2,000. Wednesday's data showed that the U.S. services sector slowed more than expected in March. Separate data also showed private sector job ads fell well short of expectations. Well, now let's go to South Africa, where we have a story from our bureau there. That's Gilbert Hango, the 11th Director General of the International Labour Organization, is visiting, and he sees meetings with top government officials. At the top of the agenda in the conversation is the ILO's push for measures to prioritize social justice, including the reduction of inequality in national and global policy making. Ongo is also the first DG of the ILO from the African continent. During his visit, he will meet with the president there, Cyril Ramaphosa, the Minister of Labour and Employment, members of the National Economic Development and Labour Council, and United Nations officials. Well, our correspondent in South Africa, Innocent Semusa, sent in this report from Pretoria.
It's his first visit to South Africa and top of the agenda of the discussions for the Director General of the International Labour Organization, ILO, Gilbert Hongpo, is the body's push for social justice, including the reduction of inequalities in nation and global policymakers.
We just cannot accept that at the time where we have 10% of the richest part of our global population still taking off 52% of world income. So we really need to look at those codes, and some code need to be broken and change the discourse and change the policy. And this is what it is about.
This visit by the ILO DG includes a meeting with South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as members of the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC. His host, the Minister of Labour and Employment, Thulas Nxesi, says government is committed to helping SMEs, creating jobs and eliminating poverty.
One of the debates, for instance, is this debate about, do you need to relook at our labor laws in order to ensure that the small businesses are able to create jobs? But you can't do that. You sacrifice the rights of the workers.
Mr. Hongpong highlighted the ILO's commitment to promoting decent work for all in Africa, especially given the slow pace of the development and promotion of international labor standards on the continent.
Nigeria also, they do have something, not exactly the same thing, but something that is not too far from it. But the South African model, not only I like it, but it's not new. I have to say that it has already been recognized to really be very effective. But by far and large, when I compare to a lot of countries, is a step forward in encouraging the different parties, from the government to the employers to the workers to the civil society, to sit around the table and dialogue. And this is the more you do that, the lesser the risk of social tensions.
It is estimated that the global unemployment rate in the world is between 6.3% and 6.5%. Delegates gathered here today with an enormous task ahead of them, which is to revive hope to the jobless. From Pretoria, South Africa, Innocent Semusa, Channels Television News.
Welcome back to Watching Business Incorporated here on Channels Television. Well, an interesting commodity is our focus this afternoon. It's coffee. Means different things to different people. Some people love it for the aroma. Some people love it for the after effect. But guess what? It's a commodity. And the Economist Intelligence Unit has estimated that global coffee consumption will grow by just 1.2% this year. That's 2022-2023 crop year, compared to 1.8% in 2021-2022. What are the reasons for this? You know, for more people are embracing coffee. Well, to help us delve into this, we have Daniela Omubodede, analyst with Financial Derivatives Company. Hi, Daniela. Good to have you again this week. Do you love coffee?
Good afternoon. Thank you. No, unfortunately, I don't.
So why do we have this week in demand? Well, it seems more people, you know, are finding the use of coffee, you know, to stay awake, to stay energetic, you know, the aroma and all of that.
So yeah, one of the reasons for this forecasted slowdown in the growth of coffee demand globally is as a result of the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war, such as high food and energy prices. Also, in the United States and Europe, the coffee demand is this year is largely going to be affected by weak economic growth and soaring inflation, which is eroding their disposable income levels. And then in Brazil, Brazil is also currently experiencing economic instability. There's also high unemployment rates. So the US, the Europe, and Brazil alone account for over 50% of global coffee consumption. So coffee demand, which is going to decline in these three places, is definitely going to affect the global outlook for the coffee market this year.
And I suppose that's not good news for the companies that are involved in the production or marketing sales of coffee.
Well, for most companies, for example, Nestle, which is a major player in coffee production, Nestle, for example, coffee already has their own coffee farm, so they are most likely not going to experience high cost of production. They are going to incorporate these high prices into the price of their coffee products, which they sell to consumers. So at the end of the day, they might experience an uptick in their revenue and profit levels.
Yeah, so Nigeria used to one time be one of the top producers of coffee, at least in Africa, but it seems we've lost that position.
Yes, as a matter of fact, Nigeria's coffee production has actually declined by about 50% in the last 15 years. Most coffee production in Nigeria actually dated back to like the 1920s, but since the oil boom, there has been like a massive decline in coffee production. Most of our coffee farms are now depleted. Our coffee trees are no longer productive anymore. They are aging. So, and coffee trees are aging and less productive. However, the government can also, provide or grant credits to some of the coffee farmers, support agricultural initiatives, basically things to make coffee production effective and less difficult. This way, some people will be encouraged to go back into coffee production. Even the young people will actually be encouraged to tap into the potentials of the coffee industry.
All right, Daniela, we do hope that at least the new administration will give some attention to things like this, even though we do have a lot of potential, not just coffee. But thank you for sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon. All right, from next week, same so eyes and feet, if they're not there already, will be at Washington, D.C., because the IMF and the World Bank, they're in full preparation for hosting thousands of delegates and media at the 2023 spring meetings holding there in the United States of America. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank jointly host the meetings of the world's finance ministers and central bankers, along with civil society organizations, parliamentarians, and nearly 600 journalists. The 2023 spring meetings of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund will take place in person from Monday to 16th of April, and IMF headquarters in Washington. Some of the issues on the table for the meeting include the IMF working with authorities in several African countries to provide and help stabilize their economies and financial situations. We know that Ghana is seeking funding from the fund as it is struggling with its worst economic crisis in a generation. Ghana secured a staff-level agreement with the IMF in December for a $3 billion loan, but approval is contingent on its restructuring its debt of 575.7 billion cedis. That's about $47.6 billion. And the fund is now waiting on assurances that the reforms will be put in place. In Ethiopia, a peace deal signed between the government and dissidents from the northern Tigray region 4 months ago has sparked hope of a new agreement with the IMF. We also have Zambia there, the first African country to default on its sovereign debt in a COVID era. An IMF team is in Zambia to work with authorities on a review of its program. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund, that's the IMF, has reached a staff-level agreement to offer $3.5 billion of loans to Côte d'Ivoire and help the government of the world's biggest cocoa producer to improve its finances. The 40-month agreement will be under the Extended Credit Facility and Extended Fund Facility. And the Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, has tapped the IMF 17 times for credit facilities. 3 weeks ago, the IMF announced in a statement following a visit to the country by senior officials that indirect and direct subsidies to curb price pressures, higher security spending, and worsening terms of trade amid robust domestic demand led to a widening of macroeconomic imbalances in Cote d'Ivoire last year. South Africa now, Spain is providing 2.1 billion euros, that's about $2.3 billion, to help fund South Africa's energy transition and water needs, even as some of the world's richest nations struggle to push forward on a groundbreaking climate finance initiative with the continent's most industrialized country. The Spanish funding is being provided through a mixture of financial instruments, with the country's government working with its development finance institution, or FIDIS, and South Africa's Industrial Development Corps. In October 2022, South Africa's cabinet had approved an investment plan for $8.5 billion package to accelerate the country's transition away from coal and towards clean energy. We head to Ghana now, where the Ghana Water Company Limited is on the heels of consumers who are said to be currently choking the life out of the company because of arrears to the tune of 800 million cedis so far this year, 2023. The arrears stood at 684 million cedis in January 2022, but shot up to 800 million cedis after the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission granted tariff increase of almost 22%, despite the water producer proposing 120% increase. Deputy Managing Director in charge of operations, Peter Devi, disclosed that nationwide disconnection exercise will commence once this is not successful. The greenback has replaced Zimbabwean dollar as the most used currency in the Southern African nation for a second time, almost 4 years after the reintroduction of the local unit. US dollars were utilized for 77% of transactions this year, surpassing the proportion that were conducted in the local currency for the first time since it was reissued in June 2019. The Zimbabwean dollar was abolished in 2009 and replaced mainly by the United States dollar after an episode of hyperinflation rendered it worthless. It was reintroduced in an attempt to revive the stagnating economy, but looks like that's not successful so far. Kenya's electricity import hit a historic high in January due to the country's worst drought in more than a decade that hit local hydropower generation. The country imported a record 68.48 million kilowatts per hour of electricity in January. Fresh data from the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics indicates that is up 39.73 million units, that's about 58.01%, was imported from Ethiopia after the two countries inked a power purchase agreement for the evacuation of cheaper hydropower from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Kenya in January officially started importing 200 megawatts of cheaper power from Ethiopia after a trial run in November, which has helped stabilize the power supply. That's the program for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm Ini John Mekwa.